Thursdays with myself, Aman, for our 11th episode. Delighted to have the one and only Sara Robertson join us live all the way from Toronto. It's 9 a.m. over there. It's 5 p.m. in Dubai. And we're going to talk about all things to do with building an anti-fragile mindset. But before we get there, just a bit of a backdrop. So Epiq Thursdays, as for those of you who've streamed in before, is all about teaching, guiding, inspiring people to get into action when it comes to looking at things in terms of peak performance, optimal performance on both the physical side, the mental side, as well as the emotional side. And we talk to people all across the world. We've spoken to people in Australia, we've spoken to people in Dubai, we've spoken to people now in Toronto, we've been all over. So this is going to be a fun next 20 minutes. Let me just do a bit of a quick background on the impressive credentials that are on the table over here for those who are watching us now or will watch this show later. So with Sara, she has, she's been, we have a bit of common elements there, which I'll come to in a minute, but as a background, she's the founder of LimeHorse. It's a professional education company that's offering online and in-person training in mindfulness, emotional intelligence, organizational development, and peak performance. She's a faculty and advisory board member of University of Toronto's AMM-MIND program. She's a co-chair of the Ontario chapter and CLE planning task force member with the Mindfulness in Law Society, a performance specialist at Mindfulness Gateway Consulting, and very importantly, which is where I guess we are, in kindred spirits, Flow Genome Project Certified Coach. She's a regular contributor on various publications, and I think, look, here's the fun part, right? She has got an equal love of opera and roller skating, and she has gone through this journey, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, through an extreme burnout event in her own personal life. And that's got her to, I guess, realize that there's the value and the power of building these anti-fragile mindsets. So I think this show is about talking to you, Sara, not about me. So I'm going to shut up right now. I'm going to bring you back. And so welcome again, Sara. Thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Great. It's great to be live with you. So I guess you want to dive in now?
Absolutely. Do it. So, I think people know or may know what about mindsets are, but let's talk a bit about, what do you mean by mindset? And then what do you mean by anti-fragile? And then let's talk about, how do we start building it in case you don't have it?
Yeah. Okay. So, let's just say we're going to talk about mindset as, how we perceive the world, whether that's, external or our place in it or ourselves. And then another thing I think we want to just briefly cover is systems, because anti-fragility has a lot to do with systems. And we can look at systems like our body's a system, our relationships are systems, organizations, institutions, environment. So anything where you've got multiple parts working together can be considered a system. And so when we talk about, so anti-fragility is this term that was coined by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. And so he was a risk analyst and he's an author and sort of philosopher now. And he talks about this in a range of different areas, but specifically more in external systems. But my belief is that, our systems are only as strong as the parts that are in them. And so if we want to have anti-fragile systems, that having anti-fragile people or people with anti-fragile mindsets are only going to support or enhance that system. So, with a system, when you have a weak point, that either creates the fragility or you're having to overcompensate in some other way for it. So just to kind of go through it quickly, under this sort of concept, fragility being things that break easily. Then you would get into robustness, which is when things are something that's under stress and it's like moderately harmed but doesn't break. Then we get resilience, which is a big buzzword lately. And under this framework, resilience is something that, returns to the state that it was before. So it's unchanged. So it's something that endures. And then we get into agility. So for the business folks would understand, agile is being able to adapt quickly. And then we have this anti-fragility. And so the term came from sort of the exact opposite of what fragility is. So rather than breaking under stress, it actually improves under stress. And interestingly, the human body and the mind are inherently anti-fragile. We need challenge in order to grow and adapt and to thrive, and even to the sense where when we become too comfortable, we tend to create problems for ourselves. So the concept behind this is not having an anti-fragile mindset is not that, we're not looking for no problems. It's more about good problems, and actively seeking those out. So rather than just, in a resilient or agile mindset, would be just responding to what's coming at us or responding to our environment. And an anti-fragile one is actually making space to seek out things that are uncomfortable or have uncertain outcomes. And what this does is, creates this foundation that when we have these, what maybe you would call black swan events, things that come out that we haven't planned for or weren't expecting, you have the mindset built already to approach these things in a way that is not avoidant or fearful. It has a lot to do with confidence building and a belief in our ability to basically be able to meet any challenge that we're faced with. And it's also, gets us out of this pleasure happiness trap and more into a real, like a purposeful and meaningful way of living. So one of the things, what kind of goes with this is looking at your life, with kind of curiosity and experimentation. So you're kind of becoming both like the scientist and engineer of your life at the same time. And so it's almost kind of like a growth mindset on hyperdrive, where, we're not just viewing things with a growth mindset, but actually like actively going out and seeking ways to be uncomfortable or activities with uncertain outcomes, like for the sole purpose of being able to flex this muscle or build this skill.
So I love the engineer and the scientist sort of, I guess, analogy there. Keeping in mind that people are in general, especially in the last few months, have been super stressed and they're kind of handling more than they would have otherwise. Mm-hmm. How could someone in that environment want to have that motivation to seek out even more stress or seek out more challenge, because they feel they probably have already tapped out at the top? So, what in your mind would give someone that, I guess, courage to move forward when they feel that, if I push myself too hard, I may break. So to your point of fragility, I would just shatter because I can't handle it.
Yeah. So an interesting thing when we talk about this is, and Taleb speaks about this in his book too, is that anti-fragility is built in times of acute stress. So recovery is really important. So this is where I feel like we actually create more fragility when we're under these like long-term chronic stress scenarios. And this maps well over, I don't know if you're familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law, where it's stress and performance. So as stress increases, performance decreases to a certain point. And because you and I are flow people, that maps really well over the flow channel, because that's a skills challenge ratio. So it's when we're tapped out at this point in time, it becomes a matter of where do you have control and agency in your life. And for a lot of people, it's really on perception and mindset. And so looking for opportunities to adjust or shift the way that you're perceiving things is, I think, kind of one of the core skills in anti-fragility. I won't say the quote because I don't have it handy with me, but if Viktor Frankl, who wrote A Man's Search for Meaning, has a quote about, man always, like, the last thing available or something along that line is your ability, like how you see things or how you perceive things. So being able to shift that mindset into looking at the things that are challenging as an opportunity to grow, see what you're made of, become curious, look at the opportunity and chaos for innovation, because that's where, like, innovation comes from moving into the unknown. Like, it's a high risk deal when you want to be innovative. And so, like, trying to move away from this idea of, like, I like to call it like micromanaging the future, when you're doing too much in like risk management or forecasting or being more fear-based, is spending all of this time trying to sort of micromanage or control the unknown, seeking stability. And really, like, if we want to be in acceptance of reality, like uncertainty, chaos, unpredictability, all of those things are that is what the world is like all the time. It's just our relationship to it that gives us this illusion that there's some sort of predictable standard that exists in the world. If I'm kind of making some sense there.
Oh, it does. I mean, absolutely. And I think for the audience, which is the entrepreneur audience, I think that's so right, right? Because they've got to figure change is the only constant thing they have in their lives. You know, how do you
Mhm.
deal with that? How do you thrive in that? Not just survive. And so, if someone was not so familiar with how to orchestrate this anti-fragile, or at least start switching on the tap, so to say, what would be some steps they could start doing in the next day, few days, weeks, at least that gets them in the right frame to,
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, framing is important. If I have to kind of paraphrase what you're saying in a way, how do you kind of, reconstruct those realities which are there in front of you so you don't kind of live in your own paradigms and sort of stuck
Yeah.
mindsets?
Yeah, so I think like taking a holistic approach is important. I have a mindfulness background, so being able to, go into that place of kind of having that metacognition and observer and being able to look at how you're interacting with things is important, making space for reflection. But by holistic approach, I would say, taking care of your physical self is important. I mean, having a good, healthy body foundation will support having that ability to have that sort of flexible emotional flexibility or flexible perception. I mean, if you feel like crap, it's hard to see the world in a curious way. So taking care of your exercise, sleep, nutrition, hydration, mental, we talked about moving away from that micromanaging the future, and more towards self-awareness, acceptance, and action. So that's like 3A pillars of mindfulness. Just looking at how you are in the world, what's really happening in the world, and then that puts you in this really great, place of self-agency where you can make choice. You have choice, and then there's emotional. So having a foundation of worthiness and integrity is important. Hard things are easier to do when you feel connected to them in a purposeful way, and then also building really meaningful connections and relationships. So nurturing sort of all of these healthy foundational pieces that's like the anchor. So like the stronger the anchor, the further the ship can go out to can float out to sea, sort of thing. And I like to look at it that way and saying, like, you don't have a strong anchor, this uncharted territory feels a whole lot scarier than if you do have this place where you're like, oh, okay, this is unknown and it's scary, and it's uncertain, but I have this anchor that I can always return to, and that kind of creates um, that stability, which is self-created, as opposed to being stability in an external sense. So it really moves us towards that, like that deep self-agency that we need to kind of go and explore in that way.
One of the things I think which you've mentioned earlier offline is the idea of having scheduled play as a recovery tool, right? So how do you kind of schedule something which helps us get in the right frame for recovering post any sort of active, intense, sort of mental or physical
Yeah,
activity?
yeah. So when I mean doing things that are, I'm not saying when you're doing things that are uncertain that you have to go walking around in the bad part of town. Like that's not what I had in mind, but things that are outside of your comfort zone. So for example, roller skating, which I said that I'm into. I am not good at roller skating. I keep going and doing it because it challenges me in a way that's different from what I do most of the time. And so for someone else, I mean, that could be it doesn't have to be this big, audacious thing. It can be as simple as like going and joining a online language group, if that's something that feels kind of outside of your comfort zone. Or if you're a hard charger, maybe taking some time to do something that is less sort of um, uh, active all the time. Like there are lots of different ways, and it's a very individual thing. So you have to, I kind of look at it and say like, oh, if there's something that sounds both interesting and terrifying at the same time, then that's probably a good direction to start
I like,
stretching yourself in that way.
yeah, I think I go back to at least again the flow genome sort of process where we had to do the opposite movement exercise, right? I
Yeah,
mean, you mentioned that you're a hat, so I do intense martial arts. So I started doing yoga, which was like
yeah,
the
exactly.
opposite, right? And like it initially was like very strange, but I realized the value and benefit of that after just the first session. I'm like, okay, this is like what I've been missing, and
Mhm.
that initial sense of that's A, not cool, or B, not fast enough, and how will it kind of still be useful was that initial mental block that had to be kind of worked with. So Totally get that. So in the work that you do professionally as, LimeHorse, otherwise, what are you finding are coming up as key issues, concerns, or challenges, especially in the last few months, that you've helped people overcome, if I can say, with these principles from building an anti-fragile mindset?
Um, I mean, everyone right now is the big thing is like, how do we pivot? How do we pivot? Pivot's the word for 2020. Um, and the thing is like people are saying like, how do we pivot and wanting to be told how to do that. And that's the thing is like, this is what we're talking about with this anti-fragile thing. Like you have to be willing to go in a direction where there's an unknown outcome and be able to have, sort of the, tenacity to endure the parts that are going to be difficult. And, we have a lot of, I mean, the law, like I work a lot in with people in law, and the law is very much like hierarchically structured, and they're still using fax machines, so they've been a decade behind for a long time, and all of a sudden they're having to make this huge change, which is difficult and painful and necessary. And so focusing on what the opportunities are, as opposed to how do we get back to where we were. I find that there's a lot of that, like, how do we get back to normal? How do we get back to normal? It's like, well, there never was a normal. It was just what you were doing for that period of time, and it doesn't apply anymore. So this is where I'll start talking to people a lot about like letting go of how they think it needs to be. And so that's been a lot of my work has just been around that, building like that scientist, engineer, like creativity type of work at this point in time.
Cool. And so, I mean, if you were to, maybe as we think of the last few kind of nuggets in our show, three things to get people going. Like, if they're saying, here's your ABC guide. If you do this, you cannot go wrong, right? You'll at least you get on the journey, and then of course discover, be the scientist, like you said,
Yeah.
and then you find your own pathway. But if you do these 1, 2, 3, then
Yeah.
you will know that you're on the right start.
Okay, so here's a couple of good ones. So first one would be definitely, get those foundational practices in order. The health, the mental, the emotional stuff, like get that anchor set. The next one would be, there is no such thing as failure, in the sense that, you're inviting failure as a teacher. The idea of, oh, what if we fail? What if we fail? Like when you can tweak that perception of failure as something that is a gift in a way, then there's, like we've said, like how can they not go wrong? And I'm like, well, if failure is no longer a bad thing, then you can't go wrong. And I would even argue that there's always something to learn. Like even if something happens, you're like, oh, that was a waste of time. And it's like, well, no, was it a waste of time, or was it an opportunity for you to realize that that's not the best way to do that thing? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't create value for you. So you've learned something, don't do it that way again. And so that's what I say, like taking that negative, flipping that script on how you're perceiving that. And then I guess the last thing would be getting into like actually carving out time to be more intentional about how this is the engineer part, where it's like how do I structure myself in a way that's both like it's equally stable and flexible, if that makes sense. So you're making space for bringing in these practices, for being able to adjust your point of view, to look at aligning with your values, but also having the flexibility to be able to go with whatever sort of if we're going back to the anchor in the boat, like what the seas are like that day.
So intrigued to ask the following question: what was a point in time in the last 6 months where you felt you had to really draw down on your reserves of all these things that we've been talking about, where you felt, damn, I need to now practice it at an even higher level, because otherwise I can't, perform?
Well, so I have a 12-year-old daughter. I'm a single mother. So, all of a sudden school shuts down, was managing my emotions around that, her emotions around that, having a child at home. My business is remote, and simultaneously, because of the type of work that I do and the programs that I offer, all of the law societies and bar associations here started offering free programs that were somewhat in alignment with the things that I offer. So basically, my paid work all of a sudden was being offered for free by someone else. And then I, was doing double duty on this caretaker thing at home. And it was like really challenging. It's like, what am I, how am I going to manage this from the business aspect? I mean, there was definitely some anxiety around, like, is there a way, like, has basically did somebody come and mow my lawn? Like, is my market share gone? And what to do about that? And there was a lot of mental work there, to be like, is this something I'm going to continue moving forward with? Like, how do I look at this as things are changing? And so that was kind of my experience with the last 6 months being really challenging in that regard.
Well, I admire, because I mean, obviously when you go through that experience that, you can say, look, I had the bruises, but I'm still smiling at the end of it, right? I'm still moving forward and learning from it. And that's so important, because we keep getting hits, as they say, right? But you kind of keep moving forward with that.
Oh, and I think humor is important.
Oh yeah, of course. A smile never is a bad idea in this situation. So if, Sarah, for people to get in touch with you post this, you're going to be sharing this content later on different platforms. What's the best way to connect with you? Website, Instagram? What's the best way?
Yeah, I mean, you can connect with me on Instagram, go to my website. I get a lot of strange spam in my general mailbox. So for people watching this, if you want to get me at Sara@LimeHorse.com, so it's just SARA at LimeHorse.com, I'm more likely to get that than in the dredges of the general mailbox. So those definitely either way. I mean, you can DM me through Instagram or connect with me via email. Both of those work.
Cool. And so we always ask our guests to set a challenge of sorts to our audience. So if you have a 7, 14, 30-day challenge that you think will help them start moving in the right direction, what would you suggest they do?
So I had a 7-day one. I mean, even if you only make it through a couple of days of this, I think it's still going to be useful. But I call it a time audit because a lot of times we'll hear, and especially like, entrepreneurs, lawyers, any other high performance professions, time is always a concern. And I find, like, if you're trying to do save money without doing a budget or a financial audit, like, if you don't know where your money's going, how do you save it? This is the same sort of concept. So my challenge is to take, if you can do it for 7 days, just to write down all the activities that you do in a day and the amount of time spent on them. And please be objective about this. This isn't about judging yourself, like, oh, I did this thing and I'm a horrible person, or I'm a time waster. It's just, this is the scientist part, like, you're observing. And then after the 7 days, I want you to take this and align it to some of your values. Now, it's best if you have good values. This doesn't work as well if you don't have good values. But being able to look at your time and say, like, how does this align with my values? And that does a couple of things. Helps you to remove any cognitive dissonance between your behavior and your values or your emotions. And because we're emotionally driven, when we can connect with things, that can change our perception of it as well. So, I had an example that we talked about earlier where I said, you might put laundry and say, like, oh, laundry is not a good use of my time. But, if you value your family and having a healthy home, orderly home for your family, you can switch something like laundry to being like, oh, I have to do this, which is, external locus of control, to internal locus of control, saying, like, no, I do this because it's important for me to have, this aligns with my values in this way. So things that don't align with your values, you can chuck or outsource or whatever it is that you need to do. But it's just an exercise in being able to, move into that sort of extreme agency where everything that you do is a choice. No one has to do anything. It's just, is it in alignment with what you want to do? And are you willing to accept, the outcome of not doing it? So
cool.
That's the challenge.
Very good. Well, look, I find that I think I'll have to rename the show from Epiq Thursdays 20 minutes to 25 minutes, because I find that every guest that I'm bringing on, there's so much to talk about that we can never finish in 20 minutes. But it's brilliant, Sarah. Thank you very much. You've been very kind and generous in sharing your wisdom and insights and learnings. We look forward to people learning from this, and of course, making the changes happen in their lives that will help them move to that next level of epicness, if I can call it. So with that, everyone, thank you, Sarah. Again, I'm going to sign off. Look forward to seeing you to our next show next week. And until then, enjoy the weekend in the region, Dubai. And for those who are watching in the other part of the world, you got one more day to go. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Aman.